Someone wanted to explore the topic of responsibility and non-doership. And there's usually a lot of confusion around non-doership. And this always comes from the belief in being separate. As a separate doer, do I have responsibility? I feel like I have responsibility. And what does this non-doership mean? And the mind interprets non-doership as not doing anything. I'm just going to sit on the sidelines. I'm just going to sit this one out, not do anything. It interprets non-doership as this passivity. And both are not true regarding non-doership. So to clear up this confusion, the most simple approach to this is to explore who you think you are, to explore this separate doer that you believe to be, to explore this me that I believe to be. This would be the most simple approach, most simple, most practical. But usually the confusion lies in this, well, I feel like I am the separate doer, and now I'm being exposed to these teachings about non-doership. And now I'm trying to basically apply non-doership as a separate doer. And this creates a lot of confusion. It creates a lot of just tension within. That you can't just simply apply this teaching if you believe to be the separate doer. You can't just adopt non-doership as a belief. So the simple approach is to explore who you think you are right now. Explore this. Really go in depth and explore, as a separate doer, are you actually doing? What is this separate doer? Who is this separate doer that you take yourself to be? So this is the most simple. Now, if there's confusion and perhaps we're maybe avoiding that, we can look at these two options. Is give it all to God. Is to simply surrender this personal will, these personal desires, the resistance to this moment, and just simply accept what is, because it's all God's doing. Let thy will be done. Or option B is take full responsibility. Right here, right now. Now, the way I use responsibility, just to clear it up, because there is usually a lot of confusion around this word, is when I mean responsibility, I mean the ability to respond. The ability to respond here now. This is what I mean by responsibility. Now, if I believe to be a separate doer, I'm going to be very reactive. The more identified I am as a limited self, the more identified I am with my limitation or my limitations. Really, there's just one limitation, and this is what you would be exploring. But if I am identified as just this is the limitation. And reactivity is limited. Reactivity arises on behalf of a personal identity. The more identified you are as a person, the more limited you feel. The more reactive you are. Now, when I use responsibility, I'm actually pointing to the complete opposite of that. That you're less reactive. The more responsible you are, the less reactive you are. You're no longer reacting to this moment, and instead you are responding to this moment. And the difference is radical. Reactivity arises on behalf of conditioning, the conditioned self. Responsibility arises on behalf of the unconditioned self. We could say that reactivity is of fear, and responsibility is of love. Reactivity is resistance. Fear is resistance. So reactivity is resisting this moment, resisting what is. Now you see how you can't be responsible when you are resisting what is. You can only be responsible by allowing what is. You can't be responsible when you are rejecting what is. The ability to respond to what is only possible by allowing and accepting what is. Reactivity is of the personal self. If I believe to be just a personal self, this limited personal self, I'm very reactive. Now, the less I'm identified as a person, just this person, the less identified I am with my limitations, the less identified I am with my conditioning, then I am more and more impersonal. Responsibility is impersonal. Reactivity is personal. Responsibility is impersonal. Responsibility is the ability to respond to this moment. Whatever needs to be done is simply done. But you see, as a personal self, there's these personal preferences, these personal fears, these personal desires that really get in the way. It's this resistance. So if the question is, well, as a person, how does responsibility fit into this non-doership? Well, right there is the kind of the error in the question, or this assumption is there's really no such thing as personal responsibility. Responsibility is impersonal. And this is what we see just in this apparent evolution, this apparent journey, is we see that responsibility really marks what we call maturity. This maturity is really this letting go of conditioning. It's letting go of limitations. It's letting go of just being so personal. Personal equals limited. So as you are letting go of these limitations, you find that you are more and more impersonal and more limitless. This reactivity is very much this selfishness. Selfishness is this limitation. I'm just this, being self-centered. You can't be responsible. There is no responsibility for one that is selfish, self-centered. It's the inversion. If everything is about me, there's just me, and it's you don't even see the needs of the moment. You only see your personal needs. So we see this maturity in this journey that we call our life. That you just see that with greater and greater responsibility, you have the sense that you are more and more mature. At the start, if you aren't responsible and you're very reactive, this is what we call as like being a victim. You're a victim of others. You are making me feel this way. I'm not responsible for the emotions that are rising. Instead, I'm not able to respond to what is, and I'm blaming. It's you. There's a reaction. We see this as we grow up and perhaps start going to school, maybe taking care of a dog, maybe our first job, maybe start a family, build a business. You see that actually this maturity, there's greater and greater maturity through that evolution of having more and more responsibility. But there needs to be this letting go of the limited self, our limitations. There needs to be a letting go of that conditioning. So in just this experience of life, you might find that you're very selfish at one time. But then it feels like you matured, you now have a family, 2 or 3 kids. You find that you're more selfless as a mother. Right? So there's this your sense of you're more impersonal, or you can say that instead of being so self-centered, now your sense of self has now expanded. It's another way of looking at it. That there's now an inclusion of your 3 kids as yourself, that you're taking care of them. You're meeting the needs of the moment. Less and less reactive, more responsible, the ability to respond. So with greater and greater responsibility, there's also the experience of more inclusion, a greater embrace. It might be an inclusion of a pet, inclusion of a job, inclusion of a family, inclusion of a business, inclusion of a community. There's just a greater embrace. Because responsibility really comes down to totality. That's why I said it's kind of an oxymoron of personal responsibility. It's like limited responsibility. But as the totality, there's just simply the ability to respond. It's the whole. With full responsibility, it's counterintuitive to what you may think, but total responsibility is actually non-resistance. So as the sense of responsibility increases, you find that there's just greater and greater allowance for what is. Meaning non-resistance. Allowance is the opposite of resistance. You're allowing everything to be as it is. And it's only because you allow everything to be as it is that you are able to respond. So back to that kind of misinterpretation of non-doership, you're not sitting on the sidelines. No, it's this totality. It's actually full action. The issue arises when there's this partial action, and this partial action is of the separate self. The separate self can't do anything total. To live totally means that you are dying to this moment. And this is what, as a separate self, can't do. It's what it's afraid of. To give yourself totally to this moment is actually non-doership. To be totally involved, fully involved, there is no doer. The experiences flow. There's not you and something called life. There's just life. And this is non-doership. Sometimes I call it effortless effort. You're fully involved. To live fully, there's no separate doer, because the separate doer is living partially. It's the experience of this reactivity, meaning this resistance, and this resistance is almost like a reservation that you're reserving yourself. No, to give yourself fully, there's no reserve. So it's this total embrace, that this responsibility, this ability to respond, it's an embrace of this moment. So there's different ways of looking at it. To give up all responsibility, it's all God and God is doing everything, that works. That's surrender. And also, 100% responsibility, full involvement to give yourself totally to this moment is also surrender. In both options, A and B, there is no separate self. There is no separate doer. So, not to complicate it, but gave you 3 options. If you believe to be the separate doer, explore who you think you are. If you're not ready for that, well, surrender to the universe, surrender to God. It's all the universe is doing. It's all God's doing. Thy will be done. Or take 100% responsibility, the ability to respond to what is. Accept what is totally. Embrace this moment fully. Live fully. Live totally. Give yourself to life. You can't go wrong with any of these options. Hopefully this helps. See you in the next one.